Greetings once again, everybody. Welcome to Diversity in Aquatics. My name is Kurt once again, and this time we're talking about something a little bit different in the diversity realm. We're talking about CPR and First Aid and how that integrates with water safety. And today I'm joined by three individuals. We've got Jonathan, we've got James, and we've got Tom. So I asked them to each do a little self-introduction so that you know who they are, and maybe starting with Jonathan.
Hi everyone, so my name's Jonathon Webber. My background is primarily in surf lifesaving, based at Piha, but also having worked for Surf Lifesaving Northern Region and New Zealand in various roles. My home base these days is the University of Auckland, and my particular areas of interest is drowning resuscitation, and I'm one of the co-founders of the International Drowning Researchers Alliance.
Cool. Thank you very much for being here. Drowning Prevention Auckland team.
Kia ora, everybody. So I'm James. I'm the operations manager for DPA. Been with the organisation now for about 4 years, I think. And yeah, our focus within DPA is preventing drowning through education, operating through the areas of schools, workplace and community groups. And my background around water safety, around first aid, really comes through surf lifesaving. So I spent many years out on the beaches as a lifeguard, still a current lifeguard out at Bethel's Beach, and also emergency care, teaching first aid, teaching basic life support through first training for many years as well. So that's me in a snapshot. And
Cool.
Tom. Kia ora everyone, thanks for having us along, Kurt. My name's Tom. I've been with Drowning Prevention Auckland for about a year now. My background comes from outdoor education and recreation as an outdoor instructor and adventure guide. From there, I've spent a few years overseas within the super yacht industry, providing water safety and water supervision on super yachts. And then more recently through surf lifesaving in the last year or so back in New Zealand. My first aid experience comes from about 6 years with what was the fire service and now is Fire Emergency in New Zealand. So my role within DPA is providing education within the workplace, so looking at the workforce within different organisations to provide them training to be safe in, on and around the water.
Awesome. Thank you very much. You saw me give the thumbs up there with the whole outdoor education thing. That's a realm that I kind of near and dear to my heart and really believe in it. So yay. I'll give a little bit of background from the CPR side because I'm normally talking about water safety, but I was also certified 1991 in emergency first, actually back then it was medic first aid, then emergency first response, and that was through my scuba diving. So that was one of the nice things of nice surprise as such, because I didn't really intend to do it. And it's something that has served me through the years as I've traveled and as I've done things. And pretty much everywhere I've gone, I've tried to integrate some form of CPR and first aid training and bring that to my workplace wherever I was. So I did it for 10 years in Korea when I was teaching English. I was basically training teachers and training students as well at university level. So I've been dabbling in the protocols all over. And that's kind of one of the things I bring to it is that international perspective. So one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this is because I'm from that water world and have seen the CPR and first aid training and seeing how often those similarities cross and how often I've used those similarities over the years. And as I enter the realm here in New Zealand, looking at it with fairly fresh eyes, I've been here 3 years, seeing that there seems to be a little bit of separation between the two and wondering what your perspectives on that is, because again, I'm new, so I could be completely wrong about that. But the idea that CPR and first aid training and water safety go hand in hand. And maybe we could start off by your ideas about that and how that looks in the industry right now? For anyone?
Oh, look, I think, and that's been a focus at DPA, especially in the workplace, but with the development of the 4Rs, is looking at how you can rescue someone out of the water without compromising your own safety. And then once you get them out of the water, what are the next steps from there? So I think, especially in the last, I don't know how many odd years, but that has become a closer tie between water safety, and also the next steps around that water safety is thinking about your own safety, but also that revival side, joining it with the CPR. So definitely a focus at DPA around our 4Rs to the response to a rescue.
Right. This might be a good time to actually say what the 4Rs are, because not everybody might know what the 4Rs.
Really? Come on,
Everybody should know.
I can share.
So the first one would be how you recognize someone in distress. So just having the basic training there, someone in distress, knowing those signs and symptoms, knowing how, so that's one, recognize, knowing how to respond safely. Absolutely key. So thinking about that response is, let's get help on the way as soon as possible. Who is phoning for help? Clock that one in, because if you end up in the water and you haven't called for help already, that's going to compromise your own safety. And then also with that response, or with that respond, is what can you use around you to get to the patient as quickly as possible? Have you got a soccer ball? Have you got a bottle? Have you got some form of flotation that you can throw out to the patient so you don't compromise your own safety? So as soon as we get flotation to the patient, that's going to interrupt the drowning process. They're going to stay afloat. They're happy. They're going to calm down. Then you can think about the rescue side. So then you can think, well, what have I got around me that I can reach out, that I can throw out, so I can actually pull this person out of the water? So that's the rescue. And then the last phase is the revival. Once you get them out of the water, what are the next steps in the way of basic first aid? What's some good positioning to have a patient in if they are conscious and breathing? If the patient's unconscious and not breathing, having some basic first aid skills so you can get into some basic CPR with the thought that you've already called for help and help's on its way. So recognize, respond, rescue, revive. And that lines up nicely with the chain of survival as well, doesn't it, Jonathan?
So that
Yeah, and I
provides
think
the two.
obviously James and the guys at DPA have a real strong focus around integrating the aspects of drowning prevention and first aid, and a lot of their programs incorporate that. Generally speaking, when people do first aid training, drowning may be a topic that is covered, and some will cover that more in depth than others. Certainly, the Resuscitation Council, who govern the CPR guidelines and the first aid guidelines in New Zealand, have the drowning chain of survival as something that's in their textbooks and guidelines. But I don't know that necessarily as a country we've really placed the degree of importance that we probably should on drowning. It's no more than 130 kilometres from any point in New Zealand to the coastline, so we have an abundance of water hazards, which are not just limited to beaches. There's rivers, there's lakes, there's estuaries, there's other areas as well. So there's a high likelihood, just by the way that New Zealanders recreate, that they could be present where a drowning incident occurs. And one of the reasons for developing the 4R model was that roughly 2% of people drown trying to help another person in distress, and typically the person in distress is the one who survives, and the would-be rescuer is the one that drowns. And we tend to give a lot of accolades to the heroism of these people who selflessly dive in to attempt to rescue another person, and we're not going to take away from that for a minute. But with a few pieces of relatively simple to follow advice like James has outlined and improvising with flotation, we actually may not have those fatalities, or certainly limit the number of fatalities that are occurring. But even when you've got rescue equipment, improvised or purpose designed, there are still situations where you may be on scene where people who are either part of your family or group or complete strangers, where someone's been brought back to shore and requires first aid or CPR. And we need as many people as we can trained and confident in those skills, because if we look at the New Zealand data, 74% of people get bystander CPR. What about the 26% of people who don't? And I'm sure the other guys would have had this teaching first aid. There's typically a lot of questions that come from students around, what do we have to do different in drowning? What are the drowning resuscitation aspects? Because, how do we get the water out of the lungs? There's all sorts of things that, people think is different in the management of a person who has drowned. But to be fair, there's actually less differences than you would think. There are some considerations, sure, but anyone who has been trained in standard CPR has actually got pretty much all the skills they need to apply to a drowning situation. But I definitely think that we could do more as a country, and certainly within the industry, to actually promote the importance of this particular type of injury, as opposed to things which maybe are far less common.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to add something in a second, but Jonathan, you wanted to share something on the screen, I think?
Yes, I've got
should be able to.
should be able to do that.
That's why I was slightly distracted for a second. This is
okay.
imperfect, but we know
the
this.
guys were talking about, oh no, that's still disabled, so I can't.
It's disabled.
Yeah, can't do that.
I'll see if I can quickly fix it, and if not, we're just going to barrel through. I can also, you can share it with me, and I can actually share it afterwards.
Yeah, I've just put it in. I've just put it in the. I put it in the chat there. So it was just a copy of the 4R model that James was talking to. So there is a graphic there. He's holding up a card there. We can provide some links, but the drowning chain of survival and the 4Rs, the graphics and the resources of that are freely available, and we just ask that people cite the producers, which is the DPA for the 4Rs, and the authors for the drowning chain of survival. But there's no restrictions on copyright sharing using those resources. And I think when we talked before, Kurt, the Brazilians, they produce singlets with the drowning chain of survival on them, and they get the kids to line up in the correct order. And there's activities like that which can helpfully cement these things, because we're not expecting people to memorize what things stand for. We're just saying, hey, if they take away from the 4Rs that they need to ensure their own safety, provide flotation or not enter the water without flotation, and call 111 and ask for the police. If they can even take away a couple of those things, hopefully that prevents a situation where they just dive into the water without any flotation and end up drowning themselves. So acronyms and doctors ABCD and those sorts of things are fine. It's so long as they apply them in some reasonable order, that's really the end point we're looking for.
Right. Yeah. I was actually going to add, because having taught internationally for so long, and a lot of the times I actually had to look up all the different protocols in different countries, because I had people from different countries in my class. So I would actually need to know their protocols to be able to segue into the protocols where I was. And I will say that very quickly, probably quite early on, I adopted the New Zealand's Australian DRSs, because for me, it was a lot easier to teach and to really highlight that beginning part of the danger, because the other protocols, they have it in there, but it's not actually part of the actual acronym. So I moved to that really quickly, and I'm really big on the stop, think, and act. And I keep saying that all the way through. So for my water safety, for me, it's exactly the same. That whole idea of stop, think, and act, and especially in the work that I do, which is primarily internationals and people from diverse communities who might not be as close to the water or have as much access to the water. That whole idea of the stop, think, and act, because you have, and I'll be talking to a group of moms, And I have to explain, hey, your instinct is going to be to dive into that water, and most of them can't swim, but they'll still do it because their child is in the water. So that whole front loading of stopping for a second, thinking what you need to do, and that is actually the shorter route to success.
Yeah, and I'm sure the other
And
guys will have some
moving
comments
quickly.
on this from teaching,
Yeah.
first aid. But there's a big mind shift around telling people what to do as opposed to what not to do. And when we developed the 4 hours model, we knew that parents were going to leap into the water no matter what we told them. And if you look at the guidelines that come from some of the overseas jurisdictions, it's call the emergency number and do
Right.
not enter the water until the emergency services arrive. Whereas we thought, well, these people are going in, we have no control over that. Let's give them some tools, which is going to ensure that we mitigate the risks to them, improve the likelihood of everybody surviving, and ensure that they actually activate the right emergency service. Because, who do you call in an aquatic emergency? Not everybody knows that in New Zealand, for inshore incidents anyway, that comes under the jurisdiction of the police. In the UK, they can ask for Coast Guard. So, even just simple pieces of information like that, who do I ask for? But it's about telling people what to do, what not to do.
Yeah.
I think it's also it's setting them up with those tools for success in a situation like that, and preparing people for the worst case scenario if things do happen. Having that mindset of what could be in your car that would help you in a rescue situation. A soccer ball, like we mentioned before, is flotation. That's going to keep someone alive in the water, and it will stop that person going in and responding, because that's the hardest thing to do is, with a loved one in the water, like you said before, Kurt, and of course, if it's family, friends, or probably most people, you'd want to jump in straight away and help them out. So it's setting them up with tools to do it safely, so it doesn't compromise their safety. And then I think around the whole CPR as well, you are right in the way of what should I do? What technique should I do? Is it different in drowning? Doing something's always going to be better than doing nothing. And having some basic first aid training, CPR training, you are actually going to be doing a lot in that situation if you're first on the scene, to have the confidence to engage with some basic CPR practice.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that as well. So the 4 hours is the base that we kind of go from for all of our programs, but it's also shifted the perspectives of a lot of the organizations we've worked with as well. So especially with organizations that work around the water. So for instance, park rangers or water care that work here in Auckland to look after our water supply, telling them just how important that one bit of flotation is to them has changed their standard operating procedures to wear foam life jackets as opposed to inflatable life jackets. And so that's really, really helped, along with educating them about the 4 hours, the procedure, and the importance of taking care of their own safety. And a lot of what we've seen within that, the surveys we've done, is people really do underestimate their own ability in swimming and rescuing someone. So the ability to, as you say, Kurt, to stop, think, and then respond or act appropriately, knowing their own ability is really, really important.
Right. Cool. Anybody have anything else to add about that specifically? It looks like we covered quite a broad range of stuff in that last little bit.
I think just, knowing that there are a number of resources that are available. So, for the beach going public, Surf Life Saving have their Find a Beach website. A lot of the councils have information as well. And, we want to encourage as many people to take part in aquatic activities as possible. But there's a little bit more to it than just sort of, rocking up to the beach and hoping for the best, or buying a boat and heading out into the harbour. So I think we just need to remind people that there are courses around being a day skipper. There's information on beach hazards. There's patrol beaches where there's lifeguards where you can source information. There's pools. There's improving your swimming ability so that you can cope when in a crisis. And the conditions in New Zealand are amongst some of the most hazardous in the world for all the beauty of our environment. You compare us to other parts of the world. Part of the reason why New Zealand leads in aquatic safety, drowning prevention, lifeguarding, those sorts of things is, I guess, because of the harsh conditions that our rescue personnel are able to go out in. But we don't want to scare people off, having a fun day at the beach or taking part in these activities. But we just want to instill in them there's a little bit more to it than just sort of saying, oh, that looks like a good idea, I'm going to go and buy a boat, or I'm going to go and follow those surfers out, even though I've never been surfing before. So a lot of preparation, but it's worth it in the long run, because most people go, for example, to the beach, have an enjoyable day, and it's without incident. But when we unpick the fatalities or the non-fatal drowning incidents, there's generally a number of basic safety rules that have been broken, and in most cases it's not just one or two, it's nearly all of them. One or two you can probably have a near miss or get away with it, but there's a common theme to these sorts of incidents. So we want to encourage people to get out there and enjoy the country, but when it comes to the water, we want them to think about the what ifs as well, without that ruining their experience.
Yeah. I have another. Sorry, did you have something to add, James?
I was just going to say, with online resources, there are plenty online, and at Drowning Prevention Auckland, we've put a lot of money and time into developing online learning as well, which is free of charge for the user.
Yep.
Which goes through all the water.
And I've done it, and it's cool.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
I have my little online certificate and everything.
Oh, good. Yeah, you get a little certificate
Yes.
on it, and lots of videos to help that learning land. So it's there. It's just the way that we can educate and direct people to those resources, and the importance of what we need to know in New Zealand is we're such a small landmass, like Jonathan said before, and we're surrounded by water. Right. Beautiful waterways, but very dangerous waterways. Yeah.
So I want to take it slightly to the side a little bit. Again, something from my perspective coming in. New Zealand and Australia, but from my experience in New Zealand, having been a CPR instructor outside, and now having gone through the system here to get my instructors again, it's a very different system than what I've seen in other places. A lot more involved to get there, more rigorous checks and balances, as it were, from the New Zealand Resuscitation Council to NZQA, all that fun stuff, which I won't get into at this point. But one of the things that, and again, this is a perception, in other places where I've been, the idea of becoming a CPR instructor and a first aid instructor and being able to offer courses at quite a low cost, because the actual cost of actually getting trained and delivering these kind of programs, there's not as much regulation. So you can do it or do it as an adjunct to something else you do. Whereas having gone through the system here, probably the only reason why I made it is because I'm so devoted to, I love teaching CPR and first aid. If that was not the case, I would not have done it, because it's very, very difficult. And it's a little bit you're going over something that you've already trained to do again, and there isn't a whole lot of way around that. So there's not a lot of recognition for what you've done in the past. So one of the things I've noticed is that the cost of courses is quite high. And a lot of people seem to not want to take CPR and first aid unless they're in a workplace which is going to pay for it. So, and again, I haven't been around long enough to understand how the ramifications of that in community, but is there an effect in community for the availability of getting trained and the people's willingness to get trained because of the cost of courses, or is there a gamut of courses that actually help support community training? Sorry.
Yeah, I think certainly I can only speak from the Resuscitation Council because I happen to be on their executive, and NZQA is a slightly different scenario because you are working generally towards nationally recognised qualifications, so you would expect some regulation around that. But certainly the what's called the ECI, or the Emergency Care Instructor Program, that the Resuscitation Council offer, there is a cost to be accredited, but essentially you're able to certify people without unit standards in your own name. So for those people who want to be involved in community first aid or CPR training, and they're targeting people who might just be doing a quick drop-in session, or it might be a public display at a surf club or at a community hub or something like that, there is the ability to provide some recognition. But of course, there's a lot of technology now with the CPR feedback mannequins that you can do sort of low dose, high frequency type training, where it's not the same as a full first aid certificate or qualification, but it might just give a member of the public the ability just to refresh, oh, that's how you do CPR, that's how you do rescue breaths. So I think that there's probably a place for better coordination, and certainly there's good overseas examples of football stadiums full of hundreds of people with mannequins doing CPR. Obviously in the COVID era that limits us a wee bit in terms of public gathering, but the 16th of October is World Restart Heart Day, which is the international day of trying to encourage bystander CPR. So I think, definitely we could do better in terms of all of the organisations, because I think that's a big strength that we have, the likes of DPA, Surf Life Saving, St John, Wellington Free Ambulance, Red Cross, all of the private training providers and other agencies who are involved in first aid, to do something to try and improve those numbers. But I think if we look at our bystander CPR rate on a comparative scale, I think I might have mentioned before, 74% of people get bystander CPR, but it's not so good if you're in the 26% who don't. And we only have 4% use of community AEDs, which also is something to improve on. So I think we need a sort of an all industry-wide annual event, which maybe outside of the COVID era ties into maybe something like National Water Safety Month or World Restart Heart Day, to try and improve those numbers. But you look at other parts of the world. I think Scandinavia is a good example. First aid is linked to your driver's license. We've got people who graduate from school who don't have a first aid certificate. We've got other people who graduate from school who do, because it's not mandated in the health curriculum. So I think it needs a multi-pronged sort of a strategy to try and improve that. But I think if there were people in the community who wanted to deliver some form of training and actually have some accreditation, whether it's via NZQA or via the Resuscitation Council, that is actually doable. But hey, if we're going to be issuing certificates and laying on courses and those sorts of things, then obviously there's a cost that comes with staging those courses and the resources and instructors and those sorts of things.
Yeah, completely understood. But I'm actually really glad you said that, because it's not easy to find out the information and to kind of chart the course, because having gone through it, I didn't realize that I could do that. And nobody told me that. Even going to the people who actually run these programs, you're usually told, oh, well, you've got to actually go through the NZ QA qualification, you've got to go through this qualification or that qualification. So one of the things I'm actually really big on is empowering communities, and the whole idea that empowering somebody within a community to actually teach these kind of things could be a really good pathway to spreading it around a community. So not saying that people need to teach workplace training, but if they could actually just teach basic CPR and be a safety person within their community. Of some of these communities, whether it be a church or whether it be an organization, can be a couple hundred people, which spreads out throughout a very large area. You can hit a lot of people that way. DPA, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you were looking at the full approach to first aid or emergency care training, becoming an instructor to deliver, working for provider and delivering NZQA unit standards. Yes, there is a few hoops to jump through to get to that mark, and of course the cost. But I think there is that side that we can develop further, where having some form of qualification with the New Zealand Resus Council and providing a discounted workshop for those to get that involvement around the emergency care and CPR out to more of the masses to get more people trained. Definitely an option. And we've looked at some different options within DPA and what we can offer the different workplaces as well throughout our training. And that's what we bring into some of the water safety or water competence work that we do. And especially in the workplace, is how can we factor in some of the basic emergency care that people need to know. It's not a NZQA qualification, but it is some training in that area that's going to help them in the time of need.
Tom, anything to throw in there?
Yeah, I was just going to also mention the flow-on effect of the skills that people learn within the drowning prevention realm, but also within the first aid realm. So you may teach one person. So, for instance, I taught 11 high school students pool lifeguarding last week, and a lot of them will go home and they'll tell their parents. They might even talk to their siblings. So it is that flow-on effect. And the same thing happens in the workplace as well. Whether it's just putting someone in the recovery position, if they learn that one skill, or just that one thought about, hang on, what about my safety before I jump in? If that can spread to their family and their friends, I think that's a really good way of spreading those messages, but something that's quite hard to measure as well.
Measurement. That's one of the things I'm working on, is that whole impact assessment type stuff, and some of this quote unquote smaller things you do actually has a lot of carry on that you don't see, and you don't see it for years. So yeah, I'm actually just as an aside, but talked to Waikato University about possibly getting an intern to help with that in terms of global swim and looking at impact assessment in a broader sense, not just we have taught one person, therefore that equals one person. That's not necessarily the case. So thinking more of a community mindset, like you say, and that's really, really cool that you're expressing that point of view, the whole carry-on aspect, and from a leadership perspective, that when your people are going through these courses, they're actually developing that community leadership mentality of not being a bystander, but jumping in and being part of the community and supporting the community.
I think just on that, one of the things that demonstrates that really well is that if a person does require resuscitation from drowning, the vast majority of people whose lives are saved by people who actually initiate basic life support interventions on the scene. Far fewer lives are saved when the paramedics arrive. So it's actually what first aiders can do by doing plain old-fashioned mouth-to-mouth ventilations, chest compressions, 30 to 2, no matter who. Those are the interventions that will save a life many, many, many more times over than the advanced skills that the ambulance service or the rescue helicopters bring with them. So although they have a place, if somebody is going to be successfully revived, it's going to be by a member of the public or a family member or a bystander getting in there and giving it a go. And I think that's why it's so important to, in the first instance, prevent these incidents from occurring in the first place, but also having a large number of people who are, drowning savvy, in that because they're New Zealanders, because they live close to the water, they know that if someone comes out of the water and they're in a bad way, they can use their doctor's ABCD approach, get in there, start CPR, compressions, breaths, keep going till the patient recovers or help arrives. Knowing that we're not going to save every person, because survival rates from drowning are pretty poor if the person has gone into full cardiac arrest. But if we can get to them before that point, the survival rates are very high. And when you hear of a parent pulling a kid out of a spa pool and giving them a couple of breaths or a few compressions and then coming round, that's the sort of scenario where, you know, it's witnessed, we're able to safely get them out of the water. And I guess that's why things like the 4Rs and the drowning training survival are really important to stress as part of first aid training. You know, again, it's all about good basic CPR that's going to make the difference.
Yeah, and I also think it's sometimes when I remember my first aid course that I went on. It was a pretty comprehensive 2-day first aid course, and it was all a bit overwhelming, really. You know, we delved into a lot of the medical conditions and different injuries. There was a lot of information in the 2 days of the training, and really on reflection of that first course and now teaching first aid, it's really, like Jonathon was saying, it's around the basics that are going to make the difference. It's your risk assessment, making sure that you stop, think before you respond, that you try to calm down so you're not just reacting and compromising your own safety, but getting into the good old doctor's ABCs. You're going to have the best chance of saving someone's life. And I agree, it's every second, every minute that counts, and that's what first aid is all about, is having the confidence to get involved, because it's going to be 10, 15, 20 minutes until emergency services arrive.
Right.
Especially in that drowning situation, the sooner we can action and get involved, the higher chance that person's going to have of revival.
I'm glad you guys are saying that, because it's a little bit validating. One of the things, and I've been noticing, I greatly respect people who have that kind of background to be able to give all of that detailed knowledge during a CPR and first aid course. But when I'm actually training, because I've got my emergency first response instructor trainer, so I've trained a couple of instructors back in the day. And one of the things I really stress is understanding the level of your group and understanding what you can deliver. And the whole idea of that scaffolding is that getting those key points in and continuing to hammer those home all the way through your course. So continuing to go back to the stop, think, and act, continuing to go back to the DRS, ABC, DSs, because that's their home base, essentially. Don't worry too much about trying to memorize it. Just move one to the next. Just keep moving. Just keep moving. And not overcomplicating it, because you don't need to know all the medical background to be able to deliver first aid. It's good, and if you can absorb it, that's awesome, but not every audience can do it. Yeah, and that takes me to, sorry, Tom, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what you're talking about there is I totally agree with that. But what I've found in respect to water safety, drowning prevention, and basic first aid and CPR training being separate, one thing that I've found is the level of understanding, especially between or within school students, is you can teach first aid and CPR in a classroom and they can do some practical outside, but it's not until you start training them specifically within the pool lifeguard realm, you take that to the pool side and you tie it into a full rescue, do they then understand the importance of what they're doing. So I think that practical aspect and always questioning why they're doing something is really important, to understand why it's important to know what they're doing and how it applies to that drowning specific scenario.
Perfect segue. Scenarios. Because scenarios is something that we do in CPR and first aid. We don't necessarily do it as much from what I've seen in the water safety. I do it, and you do some poolside, but it's not something that's pushed in that respect. It's a lot more information given. So should we be doing more scenario work in the water safety side in a similar way to the way we do it in first aid?
Well, from our perspective in the courses that we run, definitely we start from a 2-hour water safety or drowning prevention presentation, which is aimed at bigger groups. But all our practical stuff is generally more, all our longer courses are generally more practical. So our 1-day course, there'll be about an hour or an hour and a half of a presentation, and then we'll jump in the pool for 2.5 hours, and that's all practical. So There's a big emphasis on personal competence, so to see what you can actually do in the water, but then also running over those scenarios. So we have rescue tubes and throw bags and bottles.
Right.
We get the participants in there with these flotations, in with clothes, so they're actually in the water, doing the practical. And I think just from having a look and reviewing the courses that we've done, that's where the most learning comes from, is when they're actually in the pool. Yep. Even if they're outside, they're cold, they're in their clothes. That's when that light bulb clicks and they really start to take it seriously.
Right.
Yeah, I think certainly the people at DPA service are very fortunate to have access to that training. I mean, they also do training in open water as well, and obviously there's a lot of health and safety requirements that go around structuring that type of training. But certainly, if you look at professional groups like surf lifeguards, there is scenario training. But from a resuscitation point of view, the electronics of a lot of mannequins don't really fancy a dip in the ocean, so it's often clubhouse based. Although there are some water rescue mannequins, but they don't really sort of simulate a lot of the complications that you might encounter with a drowning resuscitation. Like regurgitation and those sorts of things, and frothing that that patients can do while you're performing CPR. So I think it's a difficult one in terms of how you open up that type of training to the public, because at the end of the day there are dedicated groups who are water rescue professionals, and then there's members of the public who we want to have some tools, whether it's access to public rescue equipment or improvisation with the soccer ball or whatever, who can actually do a rescue safely without compromising their or the other person's safety. And I don't know what, again, we've talked about the cost of training, and I don't know what the uptake would be on those sorts of things. I think a better idea is the work that organisations like DPA and Surf Life Saving and others do, where they go to small communities. There might be a settlement where they have a particular problem, and they work with specific people who have got the skills to train them to either a pool or a surf lifeguard level, and that's quite different, I think, to sort of offering, public rescue training or demonstrations, which I think does actually bring in an element of risk to it. And people in the past have touted learn to swim as the means of drown proofing people, but there are some studies that show that having that swimming ability actually potentially can put that person in a more hazardous situation than if they were a non-swimmer. So it's not about learning to swim, it's learning to swim and survival skills, which is always our mantra in terms of drowning prevention. And swimming doesn't make you drown proof. Most people who are rescued in the open water are not non-swimmers, and people scratch their heads and think, well, how does that come about? So it's just a statement of facts. They've underestimated their ability, the risk. They've overestimated their abilities. They've had an equipment failure, they've had a leg cramp up, they've had an injury or something in the surf. There's something that's led to it. So I think we can certainly as a nation do a lot better in terms of having people better equipped to deal with the hazards. But I think first aid and CPR, which they can apply to any situation, whether it's at home or in the community, is a really good starting point.
Right. I think it's something that we actually talked about, Jonathan, before. One of the things in the emergency first response program is that they do scenarios, but more of a mental exercise, where you have a picture and you have a situation and you actually go through what dangers would you look for, what would you consider first, what would you do first, what would you do next, and doing that in a group format. And having something like that possibly integrated into a CPR course or integrated into a water safety, because like drowning prevention would know, you can reach a much wider audience in the dry courses than you do in the wet. And the dry courses are kind of that gateway to your wet courses to actually get that engagement, and somebody actually understands that, hey, maybe I should really get in the water and try this stuff. So introducing scenario there might be something that could be useful as well.
Yeah, that just made me think as well, Kurt. There's a lot of technology out there with the virtual reality headsets, where it could
Which
be
you guys are doing too. I look through the Oculus and
it's
flying over the rips and
having the range of resources there as well, isn't it? In terms of CPR and approach coming into a scene, that would be quite a good idea, quite a good initiative, where people could run through those scenarios, mentally and prepare themselves for a situation in a secure, safe environment. Learning.
I think it comes down to also targeting, the training to the audience, and that, if people are delivering training in coastal type locations or to groups that are specifically interacting with the water, things like drowning resuscitation, hypothermia, those sorts of things are going to be, really important. And the resources, the online resources that the DPA guys have developed, it is sort of individual learning, but whether or not you log into that and project it onto the screen and watch the videos and then facilitate the quiz as a group type sort of discussion, that might be a way to improve, that knowledge around the water hazards and what to do. But I think that, it's probably a good time for the industry to really sort of take stock of the types of injuries and conditions that first aiders have to deal with in the real world, and say, what are the real New Zealand priorities, as opposed to, as James said, a first aid curriculum which has every medical condition under the sun, and we're not expecting first aiders to diagnose hypoglycemia from hyperglycemia and all the other medical conditions, to say we have a problem with drowning, we have a problem with things like forestry accidents and major bleeding and whatever the case may be, and really tailor our training to those things, knowing that if we sort of give people the basic skills, they can apply them to any trauma situation or any medical scenario, rather than skilling them up on every single possible first aid emergency they may ever encounter.
Great. Anybody have anything else to add on that one? Not necessary.
It just comes back to the core focus around emergency care, and that's immediately life-threatening conditions. Your breathing, beating, bleeding is sort of what we hammer with our first aid courses, no matter if we're doing a 2-day course, because that's related to a pool lifeguarding setting, and that's a prerequisite for what they need. But still, throughout that course, we really hammer the critical stuff around the immediate life-threatening. That home, don't we?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so completely.
Okay. So I'm conscious of everybody's time, and we're a little bit over in how long we're going to talk. Probably could keep talking about other stuff, but I'll open it up for anybody to add anything else before we close, if you'd like to. Guess not.
Nothing from me.
That was a really good discussion. Good to hear from everyone around the aquatics and CPR, around our water safety as well, and how we can tie or merge the two closer together, because I think it's really valuable training that all people need to know, and also the thought of some of the simple things that they may have on them, they may have in their vehicles, that could help to save someone's life without compromising their own safety. I don't think that's always known with the general public. They might have a drink bottle in the car, they might have a soccer ball in the car. That could really help out in a drowning situation, because like we've mentioned before and a few times through the session, that flotation is going to interrupt the drowning process, and it's going to help to keep you safe if you can get flotation to them, because we all know a lot of the time it's the bystander going in that ends up in trouble, and quite often the patient makes it back to shore safely. So that's sort of the key message from DPA, is thinking about the key education that you need to know living in New Zealand, surrounded by waterways, but also the key sort of items, tools that you may already have on you that will help in a testing situation.
Definitely, and I'd just
Concur.
add to that, you know, and when you get them back to shore, doctor's ABC, CPR, 30 compressions, and the breaths. Those breaths are really important to correct what's wrong with that person, which is low oxygen in the blood. They really need those breaths as well. So that's just the most important part of drowning resuscitation, is to make sure we are giving the 30 compressions and the 2 breaths.
I smile because we didn't even get into that topic, but that's fine. But that's really important.
That's all we need to say.
Yeah, that's good.
On that, yeah. Oh, look, it comes back to the tools that you might have in your first aid kit, eh? And
Right.
if you've got a one-way valve, a face shield in there, well, that's great. You can use that. Otherwise, it's up to you what you do. But like Jonathan said, it is really important, that 30 to 2 in a drowning situation.
Agreed. Tom, anything else to add? Not required?
No, I think we covered it all.
We covered it all. Good.
I think we did. Yeah.
Sounds good. So with that, I'll say thank you very much to all of you for taking the time for this conversation. Definitely an interesting conversation. Like I say, we could have probably gone off on a whole nother tangent again with the breaths and all that kind of stuff, which is something I'm really big about as well, but we definitely squeeze it all in there. Thanks again. I'm going to turn off the recording now, but please stick around, and hopefully we'll talk again sometime.
Excellent.
Sounds
Cheers.
good. Thanks, Kurt.